My name is Linda Warren. I'm 70 years old, a retired administrative coordinator who spent 4 decades behind desks and schedules, believing that steady hands and quiet sacrifice were enough to hold a family together. I live alone now in the red brick house where I raised my daughter, a home that still remembers more than she does. Its walls carry the weight of science fair projects, birthday candles, and piano scales played slightly off-key. Sometimes I still catch myself setting the table for more people than will come. The message from Teresa came on a Thursday afternoon while I was folding linens. Just a simple sentence. We're free Sunday. What time? No requests, no conditions, only that. I reread it 3 times, not because I didn't understand, but because I couldn't remember the last time she'd offered time without needing something. I typed out dinner at 6, then stared at the blinking cursor for a moment before hitting send. I tried to ignore the quiet lift inside me, the familiar hope I'd trained myself to avoid. I spent Saturday preparing the way I used to, not out of habit, but from muscle memory that felt almost sacred. I chose a good cut of lamb, marinated it in rosemary and garlic until the scent seeped into the house like a promise. I mashed sweet potatoes with cream and nutmeg, baked a chocolate tart from scratch, the one Teresa always said reminded her of childhood. I pulled out the mismatched crystal glasses I'd gathered from estate sales, polished the old silver until it gleamed like something waiting to be claimed, and laid out the linen napkins I'd kept folded and hidden for years. I told myself it was for presentation, but the truth was simpler. I wanted the table to say, "You still matter to me," even if the words never came. They arrived on time. Teresa stepped in first, her coat tailored, her expression unreadable. She offered a kiss that didn't quite land, her scent sharp and expensive. Jonathan followed, distracted by a call he didn't bother ending, holding a bottle of wine I hadn't asked for. Liam walked in behind them, already asking about the Wi-Fi. I told him it hadn't changed. It never does. They moved through the house like visitors in a hotel lobby, familiar with the space, but untouched by its history. Dinner began with small talk that hovered like condensation on glass, close enough to notice, too thin to hold meaning. Jonathan spoke about a new investment client. Teresa described Gloria's most recent gala with careful admiration, and I asked about school, whether Liam still played the piano. Teresa mentioned a new private instructor, someone Gloria had introduced, who was helping him make real progress. I nodded, chewing slowly, watching my daughter speak of another woman as if she'd been there all along, as if I hadn't held her hair back through stomach flu or sewed recital dresses late at night with blistered fingers. As the plates neared empty and conversation slipped into silence, I lifted my water glass. "Before I retired," I said, keeping my voice calm and even, "they made me regional manager." I offered a soft smile, not expecting applause, but hoping the sentence might land somewhere in them. Jonathan nodded without lifting his gaze. Teresa smiled. "That's great, Mom. I'm glad they recognized your dependability." Then she turned to ask him about Gloria's venue options for the spring fundraiser. The moment dissolved into the tablecloth, absorbed like a spill no one noticed. After dessert, untouched, except for the bite I took out of courtesy, Teresa rose from her chair and reached into her bag. She unwrapped a wineglass, elegant and thin-stemmed, rimmed with gold, and poured herself a small measure from the bottle they had brought. She stood there for a moment, composed, deliberate, and then began to speak in that tone she uses when she's chairing panels or thanking donors, calm, practiced, just slightly elevated above conversation. She said she'd been thinking lately about what it means to feel supported, that real love shows up quietly, without asking for credit, that some people become anchors, providing safety without noise, presence without pressure. She spoke as if describing something rare, something earned, and I watched her eyes drift just past me, as though she couldn't bear to see the person who'd once defined those words for her. Then she raised her glass and said, "To Gloria, the real grandmother, the one I wish I'd had growing up." There was no drama in her voice, no malice, just certainty. I sat still, my hands folded, and let the words settle over the room like a blanket I hadn't asked for. I didn't flinch or interrupt. I didn't look at Jonathan or Liam. I only looked at her and thought about the girl who used to call me her best friend, the one who once cried when I was 5 minutes late, picking her up from school. That girl wasn't here anymore. "She can support your family now," I said quietly, not with sarcasm, not with anger, only with the weight of truth I'd carried too long. She blinked and asked what I meant, her voice carrying a hint of confusion, as if she hadn't known the cost of her toast. I didn't respond. I rose slowly and began clearing the dishes. The water in the kitchen ran hot as I rinsed the lamb bones clean. Her voice followed me, soft at first, then sharper, telling me I was being dramatic, that she was only expressing gratitude. I let her words fall against the clatter of plates. I had heard them before, just not so plainly. When I returned to the dining room, they were already gathering their things. Teresa's coat was buttoned, her mouth drawn into something tight and composed. Jonathan offered a quick, dismissive nod. Liam looked bored. She said, "Let me know when you're ready to have a real conversation." I opened the door without a word. They left without looking back. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was exact. I stood in the doorway for a moment, breathing in the absence, then turned back to the room I had set with care. The glasses glowed faintly in the candlelight. The napkins remained folded, untouched. The tart cooled beside the sink like a memory that hadn't been asked for. It was all still here, the effort, the hope, the quiet offering, but something in me was not Dot. And for the first time in a long time, I understood that I hadn't lost them that night. I had simply stopped pretending they were still mine. The morning after they left, I moved through the house as if it were no longer mine, each room echoing with the silence they left behind. The dining table stood untouched, its linen napkins still folded, crystal glasses catching the early sun like shards of memory. I couldn't bring myself to clear anything yet. It felt like I'd been hosting a performance, and the stage hadn't fully emptied. Instead, I brewed tea and wrapped my hands around the chipped mug Teresa painted for me in 5th grade. Blue swirls, a crooked heart, the words "Best Mom" in uneven glaze. I had held onto that cup like a talisman for years, but now even its warmth felt unfamiliar. As I sipped slowly, the toast from the night before played over in my mind, not because I couldn't move past it, but because I needed to understand how easily it had been spoken. Teresa had stood in my home, raised her glass, and called another woman the real grandmother. She didn't stumble. She didn't blink. She delivered the words like a truth long rehearsed. Maybe it had been that way for a long time. Maybe she'd been saying it in other rooms, in other company, for longer than I wanted to admit. The sharpness wasn't in the statement itself. It was in how seamlessly it had fit inside her voice. I walked through the hallway where photos still lined the wall, like some museum of a love that no longer mattered. There she was with pigtails and a glittery sticker on her forehead. There she was, in her high school orchestra uniform, bow raised. And then, at 21, in a gown I'd saved months to buy. I used to see pride in those frames. Now they looked like evidence of a woman who had given everything she could without realizing how little it would mean later. I didn't take them down, not yet, but I stopped adjusting them when I passed. That afternoon, I opened the closet in the guest room and pulled down a box I hadn't touched in years. It was labeled Teresa's Things, and inside were school projects, dried bouquets, scribbled cards. One of them, on purple construction paper, read, "You make the best grilled cheese and hug me when I cry." I held that note like it was a fragile artifact. I remembered that day, how she'd come home with scraped knees and refused to speak until I wrapped her in a blanket and put on her favorite cartoon. I hadn't changed, but her eyes, the ones that used to seek mine first in a room, had turned elsewhere long ago. I folded the card and placed it back in the box. Then I closed the lid and returned it to the closet shelf, not to forget, but to allow myself the right not to carry it daily. Later, I took a walk through the neighborhood. The cold air cleared something heavy in my chest. I passed the park where I used to sit while she climbed the monkey bars. I passed Mrs. Fuller's porch, where Teresa once played tea party with porcelain cups I wasn't allowed to touch as a child. At the corner, I stopped in front of the community center. A bulletin board fluttered with announcements, and one caught my eye: watercolor for beginners. Tuesdays at 6:30 p.m., I tore off the small paper strip with the phone number and tucked it into my coat pocket, surprised by how instinctual it had felt. That evening, I found a sketch pad buried in a drawer in the laundry room. It was slightly warped from humidity, but unused. I set it on the table and opened a drawer filled with mismatched school supplies, eventually pulling out a cheap watercolor set and a cup filled with dusty brushes. I dipped one into water, dragged it across the paper, and watched the color bloom unevenly. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't anything really, but it was mine, and that felt like enough. On Tuesday, I stood outside the classroom door at the community center, listening to the sound of people settling into their seats. When I stepped inside, no one turned. The instructor, Marlene, gestured toward an open chair, and I took it quietly. She spoke of softness and uncertainty, of how watercolor wasn't about perfection or control, but about allowing mistakes to become part of the piece. I held on to that sentence. I let it rest somewhere deeper than logic. That night, I painted a bowl of fruit. It bled. It ran. It looked more like a bruise than a still life. But I signed my name at the bottom, not for praise, but as a gesture of presence. For years, I had signed my name invisibly, on checks, on permission slips, on casseroles, dropped off for school events where I wasn't invited. This time, it belonged only to me. The next morning, I didn't check my phone. I made oatmeal and read a chapter from a novel I'd never finished. I cleaned out the hallway closet and filled a box with things I no longer needed. I didn't wait for a call or wonder when she'd reach out. The air in the house no longer felt like it was listening for someone else. 10 days passed before Teresa called. I saw her name light up the screen, but I let it ring 3 times before answering. Her voice was careful, the way one speaks when they've rehearsed both defense and apology. She said she had been thinking, that perhaps I had misunderstood, that the toast was meant to honor support, not to negate mine. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't offer comfort to smooth her discomfort. When she paused, I asked, "Do you remember what you said?" There was a long silence. Then, with less certainty, I said, Gloria was the real grandmother, the one I wish I'd had. I nodded to myself. That's what I thought. She said she didn't mean it like that. I told her meaning doesn't undo impact, that when you choose your words in front of others, in a room where someone has cooked and prepared and tried, those words carry weight. She asked if we could talk again soon. I said yes, but I didn't say when. And I didn't promise anything. That night, I returned to my sketch pad and painted a shoreline. Not one I had seen, but one I imagined. The horizon bent. The waves crashed too heavily on one side. Still, I left it as it was. I signed my name at the bottom again. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a background character in my own life. I was here, brush in hand, no longer asking to be chosen. In the weeks that followed, something inside me settled, not in defeat, but in a quiet reordering. The silence between Teresa and me no longer felt like punishment. It felt like space, finally cleared, finally mine. For the first time in years, I moved through my days without the weight of waiting for her to call, to explain, to remember. The absence used to hurt, but now it felt clean, almost merciful. I began to understand that love doesn't always leave with a crash. Sometimes it simply fades until you're left holding a shape that resembles it, but offers no warmth. My watercolor classes became a lifeline. Each Tuesday, I walked into that small linoleum-scented room and sat among strangers who didn't know me as anyone's mother, anyone's fallback. There, I wasn't responsible for history or memory. I was just a woman with a brush and an hour carved out for herself. I had no talent for realism. My apples looked bruised, my shadows inconsistent, but I found joy in the imperfection. I liked the way the paint moved when I gave it space. I liked how it ignored my intentions and created its own meaning. It was during one of those classes that I met Joyce. She sat across the table with a faded canvas tote full of paints and a laugh that softened the edges of her stories. She noticed the way I used too much water in my skies and said, "That's not a mistake, that's atmosphere." We started talking after class, slowly at first, the way older women do when they're used to their stories being background noise. I learned she had recently divorced after 31 years, that she was relearning how to cook for one, how to sleep without waiting for someone else's breath beside her. There was something familiar in her, a woman who had once been central, then made peripheral, now choosing to find herself again. She invited me to join her for coffee one Saturday, and I went, not out of politeness, but because I wanted to know what it would feel like to say yes to someone who didn't expect anything from me. We sat by the window of a quiet cafe, sharing stories that didn't require defending or justifying. I told her about Teresa, in small pieces, careful not to sound bitter, even though some bitterness still lived in me like sediment at the bottom of a glass. Joyce didn't interrupt or offer solutions. She simply listened, then said, "That sounds hard, and you're still standing. That matters." At home, I made space for painting beyond the classroom. I cleared off the sewing table I hadn't touched in years and spread out my supplies. I bought new brushes, real ones this time, and a fresh pad of thick paper that made the colors bloom differently. I began painting in the mornings, just after sunrise, when the light was soft and the house most honest. The silence no longer stung, it cradled me. One afternoon, while sorting old documents in the guest room, I came across a folder marked Michael's School. It was filled with drawings, spelling tests, notes from teachers I had never met. I realized I'd been given these as an afterthought, always in a rush, always between other people's plans. I held one paper in particular, a stick figure drawing labeled "Me and Grandma Gloria." The lines were shaky, the sun had a face, and there was no space for me on the page. I sat with that for a long time, not in grief, but in recognition. I could no longer pretend I held a place in his story just because I wanted one. 3 weeks passed before Teresa reached out again. This time, it was a voice message, not a call. Her voice was strained, careful. She said she had been thinking a lot, that maybe she hadn't been fair, that she wanted to talk. I listened once, then again, not because I needed to hear her remorse, but because I was trying to detect whether she had begun to see me again, not as someone to manage or appease, but as a person with her own boundaries. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I went outside and walked the perimeter of my small yard, letting the wind clear the lingering tremble from my fingers. That night, I painted something I couldn't name, abstract swirls of blue and ochre, wide strokes that bled into one another. It didn't look like anything, but it felt like something. Movement, maybe. Or release. I hung it above my desk without framing it, letting it remain raw. The next morning, I sat with a cup of tea and opened a blank note card. I wrote, "We can talk, but this time I come to the conversation as who I am now. I won't erase myself again. If you're willing to meet me here, I'm ready." I didn't send it right away. I read it out loud, testing the words in the room. They held. They didn't wobble. So I sent it. She replied within the hour, a simple, "I understand. I'd like that." No explanations, no excuses. I agreed to meet her the following weekend at a small cafe halfway between our homes. I didn't dress up, but I did wear the pale blue scarf I'd bought last month, the one that made my eyes look rested. I arrived 10 minutes early and sat by the window. When she entered, I saw the hesitation in her shoulders, the way her eyes searched for clues in my posture. I didn't stand. I didn't wave her over with forced cheer. I let her walk to me on her own. We spoke for over an hour. Not about the toast, not about Gloria, not at first. We talked about her job, about Michael's love of dinosaurs, about how she'd taken up gardening and killed every herb in her planter box. It wasn't a rebuilding, it was a beginning. When we finally touched the topic of that dinner, she didn't defend herself. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She simply said, "I see it differently now." And that was enough. I didn't rush to fill the silence that followed. I let it breathe. Because silence, I was learning, wasn't always a void. Sometimes it was a kind of reverence, a space where something honest could finally grow. In the weeks that followed our quiet conversation at the cafe, something delicate began to take root between us. Not a full reconciliation, nothing that dramatic, but a cautious recognition that we were no longer standing on opposite sides of an invisible wall. Teresa didn't call every day. I didn't expect her to. There were no sweeping gestures or sentimental declarations. What came instead was a slow rebuilding, almost imperceptible, like the way grass grows back after a long drought, quiet, persistent, ordinary in a way that made it all the more real. She began texting every few days, short messages about Michael's latest dinosaur obsession or a new recipe she had tried and failed to impress him with. I responded when I felt ready. I didn't rush, didn't measure my worth by how fast I could show up. I gave myself room to breathe, and in that room, I found something steadier than obligation. I found choice. Each reply I sent was not a return to who I used to be, but a step into who I was becoming, a woman who could love her daughter without losing herself. One afternoon, Teresa asked if I might want to come by for a small birthday celebration for Michael. She said it casually, almost as if it were a suggestion rather than a request. I hesitated. I remembered the last birthday, the way Gloria had held court in the center of the room while I stood near the window, holding a wrapped gift that Michael barely glanced at. I remembered the way the other guests gravitated toward her, drawn to her ease, her wealth, her effortless charm. I had never belonged in that world, not really. But this time, Gloria wouldn't be there. She was in a rehab facility upstate, recovering from a stroke Teresa mentioned only briefly, without going into details. I sensed there was more to the story, but I didn't press. I said I would think about it. That night, I sat in my art room and stared at a blank sheet of paper for a long time. I wasn't sure if I wanted to go for Michael or for Teresa, or because a part of me still clung to the hope that I could reclaim something that had been slowly chipped away. But I also wasn't sure I needed to reclaim anything. Maybe what I needed was to walk in as myself, not as a replacement for anyone, not as the other grandmother, but simply as Linda. I picked up a brush and began painting a small scene, a backyard, balloons tied to a tree, a table with uneven legs. It wasn't a masterpiece. It wasn't meant to be. But as the colors filled in the space, I felt something shift. I decided I would go. The day of the party, I wore a soft yellow blouse and the earrings I had bought for myself after selling my first painting at a local craft fair. When I arrived, the house was quieter than usual, and Teresa looked genuinely surprised, but not displeased, to see me. Michael ran up to show me his new toy, a plastic T-Rex that roared when you pressed its stomach. I smiled and admired it, noticing that for once he wasn't distracted by a room full of expensive gifts or relatives waiting to be impressed. We played together for a while, just the two of us, and I felt the years between us begin to close in a way they hadn't in a long time. Teresa brought out cake and served it without ceremony, her movements more grounded than I remembered. She didn't hover over Michael or fill every silence with commentary. For the first time in a long time, she seemed still. After the party, while Michael played outside, Teresa asked if I had a few minutes to talk. We sat on the porch, two women sharing the same space, but not yet the same rhythm. She told me a little more about Gloria's health, how the stroke had changed her, how the woman who had once dominated every room now sat quietly, sometimes confused, sometimes angry. Teresa looked tired when she spoke, not just physically, but in a deeper, more permanent way. I didn't try to fix it. I didn't tell her everything would be all right. I simply listened. Then, almost as an afterthought, she said, "I think I'm starting to understand the kind of strength it took to raise a child alone." She didn't look at me when she said it, but she didn't need to. I heard the words for what they were, not a full apology, but a door cracked open, and I chose to step through it. Later that evening, I drove home along the quiet back roads, the sun dipping low behind the trees. I thought about how long I had waited to hear something like that, how many years I had spent aching for acknowledgement, and yet, now that it had come, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt still, as if something inside me had stopped reaching, had finally come to rest, not because it gave up, but because it no longer needed to stretch so far to be seen. When I got home, I washed the cake dish I'd brought, folded the blouse carefully, and placed the painting of the backyard in my drawer. I didn't hang it. I didn't need to. It had already served its purpose. And in that quiet house, still warm from the sun, I made tea and sat down to paint again. This time, I didn't reach for a scene from memory. I painted something new, an open window, sheer curtains lifting in the breeze, a view of a sky that promised nothing and yet offered everything. A few days after the party, I received an envelope in the mail with no return address. The handwriting on the front was familiar, even if I hadn't seen it in years, tidy, looping, with the kind of elegance that suggested someone who'd spent her life writing thank you notes and birthday cards on monogrammed stationery. Inside, there was a short letter from Gloria, just 2 paragraphs. The paper was thick and creamy, her signature at the bottom noticeably shakier than the rest of the text. She wrote that she wasn't sure how much time she had left, and that if I was reading this, it meant she had already begun to disappear from the world she had once commanded. She didn't apologize exactly, at least not with the clarity I might have once wanted. She said she had overstepped, that she had believed she was helping, and that perhaps her desire to be central in Teresa's life had led her to act in ways that pushed others aside. "You were always the one who raised her," she wrote. "I merely filled the spaces you were too exhausted to cover." There was something sharp and self-justifying in that sentence, but also for the first time, a sliver of acknowledgement that what she had done hadn't been entirely selfless. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant either. Mostly, I felt the dull ache of understanding arriving too late. It was like watching a wave roll toward shore long after the tide has receded. I placed the letter in my desk drawer, not as a keepsake, but as a marker. That part of my life had an ending now, however incomplete. Teresa didn't know about the letter, or if she did, she didn't mention it. In the following weeks, we continued to orbit each other gently, occasional texts, a coffee now and then, short check-ins that didn't probe too deep. She seemed quieter, a little less certain of herself, though I noticed she was beginning to ask more questions, small things at first. How did I manage daycare when she was a toddler? Did I ever think of moving away from our old neighborhood? Had I ever been in love again after her father left? She was trying, in her own careful way, to piece together the parts of me that had existed outside of her experience. It felt strange, being seen not just as her mother, but as a person with a history she hadn't authored. One Saturday morning, as we sat on a park bench watching Michael climb the jungle gym, she asked if I ever resented her. The question landed with a quiet weight. I didn't rush to answer. I looked at the trees swaying gently in the breeze, at the way Michael hung from the monkey bars with total abandon, and I thought about everything I had once swallowed to keep her safe, stable, loved. Finally, I said, no, but I did lose myself for a while, and I think I blamed you for not noticing. She nodded slowly, and that was enough. No apologies, no unraveling, just the truth laid down softly between us. That night, I returned home and painted a single open door on a blank canvas. The room beyond it was undefined, just soft light spilling outward. I didn't title it. Some things don't need names. 2 weeks later, David called Dot. We hadn't spoken since that awkward farewell months ago when they'd left my house with tight shoulders and a child too young to sense the fracture in the air. His voice was steady, but there was something in the way he cleared his throat that made me sit down before he said anything meaningful. He told me that Gloria had been moved to a hospice facility, that Teresa had been visiting every day, sitting at her bedside, reading aloud from old books, or just sitting in silence. She's not asking for anyone, he said. She barely speaks now. I stayed quiet, unsure what response would be appropriate. He continued, I think Teresa's beginning to unravel some of it, the influence, the expectations, but it's hard. It's all tangled up in memory and guilt. I understood. I had lived in that tangle for years. David paused, then said, She mentioned you the other day, said she couldn't have gotten through the last few months without your steadiness. That word, steadiness, caught me off guard. For so long I had been invisible or taken for granted, dismissed as someone who didn't quite fit into the polished picture Gloria had painted around their lives, and now I was steady. After we hung up, I didn't feel the rush of validation I once might have hoped for. I simply felt known, not celebrated, not redeemed, just understood in a quiet, unspoken way. That weekend, Teresa dropped by my house unexpectedly. She didn't bring Michael. She came alone, holding a brown paper bag filled with loose peaches and a small potted lavender plant. I thought you might like this, she said. We didn't go into the living room or sit at the kitchen table. We stood in the hallway near the old coat rack and the framed photo of her in second grade, missing her 2 front teeth and beaming with the kind of uncomplicated joy that now felt like it had belonged to another life. She didn't say much, neither did I, but as I took the lavender plant from her hands, I noticed hers were shaking slightly. I reached out, not to comfort, not to take away the weight, but just to touch her shoulder, lightly, to say I was still here, and that somehow was enough. The lavender plant sat on my windowsill, its small purple buds turning toward the afternoon light like they knew something I didn't. Every few days, I would run my fingers gently across the leaves, releasing their soft, earthy scent. It didn't take up much space, but it settled into the house like it had always belonged, quiet, resilient, patient. I found myself looking at it more often than I expected, as if its presence said something I couldn't quite articulate. Maybe it reminded me that some things grow better with less tending, that presence could be steady without being overbearing. Teresa didn't come by again that week, and I didn't expect her to. What lingered wasn't the weight of her visit, but the softness of it, the unspoken gentleness of someone learning to show up not because they felt guilty, but because they wanted to. That distinction mattered more to me than I realized. I had spent years being needed, but not chosen. There was something profoundly different about being wanted in someone's life rather than simply being tolerated in it. At work, I was preparing for a phased retirement. It had been discussed for years, always as some distant marker, but now it felt like something real. I wasn't afraid of the change. If anything, I was curious. For decades, my days had been defined by structure, forms, policies, quiet nods in office hallways. I'd been good at my job, reliable, invisible, in the way women in admin roles so often are, but I no longer needed the rhythm of other people's schedules to give my time meaning. I wanted to fill my days with something that asked more of my spirit and less of my compliance. Joyce had started talking about a summer art show in the neighboring town. She thought I should enter. At first, I laughed and waved it off, but something in her expression made me stop. "Why not?" she asked, and when I paused, she added, "You've spent your life showing up for everyone else. Maybe it's time to show yourself." The words stayed with me. That evening, I stood in front of a blank canvas for over an hour before finally making the first stroke. I didn't know if it was good. I only knew it was mine. That same night, I received a call from Teresa. Her voice was lower than usual, like she had been crying, but didn't want me to notice. Gloria had passed away earlier that morning, peacefully, according to the hospice nurse. Teresa said the words as if they had been rehearsed, spoken so many times already that their meaning had worn thin. "I thought you should know," she added. There was a pause, a breath caught somewhere between obligation and emotion. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel," she admitted, and I could hear the weariness beneath it. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I let it rest between us. Eventually, I said, "Grief is strange. It doesn't follow rules. It just moves how it wants." She didn't answer right away, and I didn't push. When she finally said thank you, it wasn't for the words. It was for letting the space exist without needing to patch it up. The funeral was small. Gloria had outlived most of her contemporaries, and her social circle had dwindled to formal acquaintances and carefully maintained connections. The service was tasteful, restrained. Teresa sat in the front pew, composed, but I saw the way her fingers gripped the edge of the program as if trying to anchor herself. I didn't sit beside her. I chose a seat farther back, not out of bitterness, but because I knew the moment wasn't mine to hold. I had made peace with Gloria in my own way, in my own time. This was Teresa's reckoning now. After the service, I stepped outside into the thin winter sunlight and stood alone near the edge of the courtyard. David approached, his face pale but calm. "She asked for you," he said quietly. "Not before she passed, before the end began." I nodded, unsure how to feel about that. It was like being given a map to a place that no longer existed. Later that evening, Teresa called again. She didn't want to talk about the funeral. She wanted to talk about Michael, about how he had asked whether Grandma Gloria would still visit in his dreams. I listened, knowing there was no correct response. When she asked if I thought children understood death better than adults, I said, I thought children accepted it more easily because they didn't try to make it logical. She was quiet for a while, then said, "I wish I'd asked you more when I was younger, about life, about everything." I told her there was still time. That night, I pulled out the painting I had started before Gloria's death. It had begun as something abstract, a blur of lines and movement, but now I saw something else in it, layers of separation, outlines within outlines. I adjusted a few strokes, deepened the shadows, added a pale thread of gold through the center. It wasn't finished, but it was becoming dot. So was I. In the days that followed Gloria's funeral, something subtle began to change in the way Teresa and I spoke. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't dramatic, but the silences between us began to feel less like barriers and more like pauses with purpose. We still didn't speak every day, but when we did, there was less weight in her voice, fewer layers of performance. She had always been someone who measured her value in composure and control, but now her words came slower, sometimes unfinished, and strangely, that made me trust them more. One morning, she asked if I might want to take a short trip with her and Michael, just a weekend drive to a nearby coastal town where they had stayed the summer before. I could tell she was nervous, even as she said it, as if unsure whether she had any right to invite me into their new patterns. I said yes, not because I thought the trip would fix anything, but because I had finally come to a place in my life where saying yes didn't mean I was giving something up. It simply meant I was willing to see what came next. The drive down was quiet in a comfortable way. Michael dozed in the back seat for much of the ride, his head pressed against the window, his hand still loosely wrapped around a dinosaur figurine. Teresa kept her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel like she'd learned in high school, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. We didn't talk much, but the silence wasn't empty. It felt like we were both waiting to see if the space could hold us without cracking. When we arrived, the motel was modest but clean, with white railings and faded green shutters. Teresa had booked 2 rooms, one for her and Michael and one for me, which I appreciated more than I let on. I didn't need separation, but I did need to feel that I wasn't being folded back into the role of unpaid caretaker. That night, as I sat on the balcony with a cup of tea, I listened to the sounds of waves crashing distantly beyond the dunes and thought about how many years I had spent imagining that the only way to matter was to sacrifice. The next morning, we visited a small local museum, more of a refurbished house than a formal exhibit. Michael wandered from room to room, asking questions about old tools and broken pottery, his voice bright and full of curiosity. Teresa followed him slowly, letting him lead, her usual impulse to manage or narrate noticeably absent. I watched them from a distance, not intervening, not offering advice, just observing this small family as if I were both inside it and gently outside. Later, we ate lunch at a seafood shack near the pier, and Michael insisted on ordering something called outdoor shark nuggets, which turned out to be regular fish bites with a dramatic name. While he dipped them in ketchup with singular focus, Teresa turned to me and asked, "Did I used to do that? Ask too many questions?" I smiled and said, "Constantly." She laughed, and it wasn't self-conscious. It was light, like air finally let out of a room that had been sealed too long. That afternoon, we walked the beach together, our shoes in hand, the tide cool against our ankles. Michael ran ahead, chasing the foam like it might lead him to some secret. Teresa and I moved more slowly. At one point, she reached down, picked up a small shell, and handed it to me. "I don't remember you ever collecting these," she said. I told her I hadn't, that I never had time to look down when she was little. She nodded, and for a moment, her eyes filled with something too complicated to name. That evening, back at the motel, Michael asked if I would read to him. Teresa looked at me as if to check whether I wanted to, and I appreciated the pause. I said yes and followed him to their room. He crawled into bed, pulling the covers up to his chin, and handed me a book about space travel. As I read, I noticed how his breathing slowed, how his fingers relaxed at the edge of the pillow. By the time I finished, he was asleep, and I placed the book quietly on the nightstand. I stepped out into the hallway and saw Teresa sitting on the floor outside the room, her knees drawn up, her arms wrapped around them. I sat beside her. We didn't speak for several minutes. Then she said, "It's been a long time since I watched you with him. I forgot what that looked like." I wanted to say it had never changed, that I had always loved him this way, but I didn't. I let her arrive at that truth herself. Before we returned home the next day, Teresa stopped at a small bookstore on the edge of town. While she browsed, I wandered to the back and found a display of handmade notebooks. I picked one up, ran my fingers across the textured cover, and imagined what it might hold. Sketches, fragments of thought, maybe even letters I would never send. I bought it without hesitation. On the drive back, the sky turned a soft gray, the kind of overcast that makes everything feel quieter. Michael fell asleep again, his head against Teresa's show. Back home, the rhythm of things returned, but it no longer felt like the same beat I had marched to for years. Something had shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, but in the quiet way a season changes, with leaves turning one by one before anyone notices the tree is no longer the same. Teresa didn't call every day, and I didn't expect her to. Our conversations had softened, deepened, and more importantly, they no longer revolved around fixing things or filling gaps. We were learning to talk as two women who had shared a past and were, perhaps for the first time, learning to be present with each other in the now. Michael began asking about painting, not in the direct way children sometimes do, but in that sideways curiosity that shows up in small comments. "I like how your house smells like pencils and paint water," he said, one afternoon, as he sat at my kitchen table eating apple slices. Another day, he pointed to one of my landscapes and said, "That looks like the place I dream about." I didn't push it, but I set out a small set of watercolor pans the next time he visited, just in case. The brushes stayed dry that day, but I caught him looking at them when he thought I wasn't watching. Teresa noticed too. "He's always been drawn to quiet spaces," she said once, almost to herself. "I think that's why he loves being here." I nodded, but I didn't say out loud what I was thinking, that maybe he loved being in a place where he didn't have to be impressive, just curious. That kind of freedom had taken me decades to recognize in myself, and watching him explore it so naturally felt like watching something I'd lost be returned through someone else's hands. That weekend, I took a walk through my neighborhood, something I hadn't done in a while. It was early spring, and the air carried that fragile warmth that never quite settles, like it's still negotiating with winter. As I passed by the houses I'd known for decades, I realized how much my world had stayed the same, while the people in it had moved on or drifted away. It didn't make me sad exactly. It made me aware of time, of stillness, of how life continues whether or not we are paying attention. Later that day, I cleaned out an old box in the back of my closet. Inside were receipts from Michael's preschool fund, faded notes from Teresa's high school plays, a photograph of me holding her at the hospital the day she was born. I hadn't looked at it in years. I barely recognized myself, so young, with eyes full of determination and something close to fear. I stared at that image for a long time, wondering if that woman would be proud of who she'd become. I thought she might be, not because life had turned out perfectly, but because she had kept going even when she wasn't certain what forward looked like. That evening, I started a new painting, not of a place or a memory, but something more abstract, layers of color that bled into one another, soft edges and blurred lines. It felt like a portrait of becoming, like all the unnamed emotions that didn't fit neatly into words. When I finished, I didn't frame it. I leaned it against the wall in the corner of the room where the light hit gently in the mornings. It didn't need to be displayed to matter. It just needed to exist. A few days later, Teresa invited me to a school event for Michael. "It's nothing formal," she said. "Just a classroom open house, art projects, and hand-cut paper suns taped to the windows." I almost said no, out of habit, not wanting to impose, but then I remembered the new space we were building, the one where presence wasn't an obligation, but a choice. I told her I'd be there. When I arrived, Michael ran up to me, holding a drawing with thick crayon strokes and uneven stars. "This one's for you," he said. "It's your night sky." I looked at it and saw the blue swirl in the center, a patch of yellow in the corner, and a small house drawn with a crooked chimney. I didn't ask questions, I just took it in. Teresa watched from across the room, and though she didn't say anything, I saw something shift in her expression. It was quiet, but it was real. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt seen in a way that needed no explanation. It had been a long time since someone called me spontaneously, without asking for something, without a list of logistics to work through or errands to delegate. So when the phone rang one afternoon, and it was Teresa's voice on the other end simply saying, "I saw something today that reminded me of you," I didn't brace myself like I used to. I just listened. She told me about a bookstore display, stacked canvases, beginner's paint kits, and a card that read, "It's never too late to start." She said she nearly bought the whole table, even though she didn't paint. I smiled into the silence between us, letting it stretch without filling it, the way you might savor the hush of a quiet morning before the world starts moving again. I didn't know what she wanted from that conversation, and that was the beauty of it. Maybe she didn't want anything except to share the moment. That was new for us. For years, every interaction had been a transaction, often wrapped in politeness, but weighted with expectation. This was different, simple, present, and for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't searching for hidden meanings or measuring how much of myself I needed to withhold to avoid disappointment. I just let it be what it was. That weekend, I finally brought out the old sewing machine I had stored in the back closet, behind boxes of holiday decorations and pieces of furniture too sentimental to let go. It had been years since I touched it. The bobbin still had thread from a dress I once tried to make for Teresa, light blue with scalloped edges, the kind little girls wear to birthday parties. I never finished it. She had grown out of that phase faster than I could catch up, preferring jeans and glitter tops by the time I was ready to hem the skirt. Still, touching the fabric again felt like brushing up against another version of myself, one that hadn't disappeared, just gone quiet. I spent the afternoon patching an old quilt I used to keep in the den. The stitching wasn't perfect. My hands weren't as steady as they once were, but the rhythm of the needle moving in and out of fabric soothed me in a way I hadn't expected. It reminded me of the years when I used to make things out of necessity, clothes, curtains, costumes, because buying them new was out of reach. Back then, I resented the effort, the time, the invisible labor, but now it felt like something different, not a symbol of lack, but of care, of intention. When Teresa dropped by a few days later, I had the quilt folded on the back of the couch. She noticed it right away. "Did you fix this?" she asked, running her fingers along the fresh seams. I nodded. She sat for a moment, her eyes lingering on the corner patch with the faded lilac print, the same fabric I'd used for her first Halloween costume. "I forgot how much you made by hand," she said softly. "I think I forgot how much of everything you made by hand." She didn't apologize, and I didn't expect her to. Her voice carried enough understanding to fill the spaces left by old hurts. Michael came by the next weekend. this time with a small canvas under his arm. He had painted a field of stars, each one a different color, and a crescent moon made entirely of fingerprint swirls. "It's for your studio," he said. I didn't correct him. My corner of the living room, with its jars of brushes and stained drop cloth, had never been called a studio before. But now, hearing the word from him, it felt real. That night, after they left, I hung his painting beside mine. Not because it matched or looked professional, but because it felt like a conversation, a quiet exchange between generations, between someone who had just started seeing the world and someone who had finally stopped trying to make it perfect. And as I sat there, the late light filtering through the window, I realized something I hadn't dared say aloud. I wasn't just healing, I was becoming again. Still, always. I hadn't been keeping track of time, not really, but the calendar marked it anyway. It had been nearly a full year since that dinner, since the toast that split something open I hadn't realized had been sealed shut for so long. I thought I'd grieved then. Grieved the version of my daughter I thought I'd lost, the family I believed I was no longer part of. But grief, I was learning, didn't always move in straight lines. It circled back sometimes, quiet and sudden, like catching the scent of a familiar perfume in a crowd and turning instinctively, only to find no one there. In that year, the house had slowly changed, not because I set out to transform it, but because I stopped arranging it around what I thought others might need. The guest bedroom, once a rotating space for Teresa's visits or Michael's overnights, had become my reading room, books stacked beside a well-worn armchair I'd found at a second-hand store and reupholstered in soft mustard fabric. The dining table, which had once seated 4 even when only one person lived here, now held a wide wooden tray with jars of paintbrushes and sketches in progress. There were still reminders of my former life tucked into corners, photos of Teresa as a baby, Michael's preschool drawings, a faded cross-stitch from my mother's kitchen, but nothing felt frozen anymore. It all belonged here, past and present, layered the way brushstrokes build a painting, not always clean or symmetrical, but honest. One Sunday morning, Teresa arrived unexpectedly with a box in her hands. It wasn't heavy, but she held it like it meant something. "These are yours," she said. "I found them when I was going through a few of Gloria's things." I didn't ask how Gloria had ended up with anything of mine, but I knew better than to be surprised. Inside were envelopes, some letters I'd written years ago, and a few photographs I hadn't seen in decades. One of them was from the summer Teresa turned 10, the two of us sitting on a picnic blanket, her head on my shoulder, both of us laughing. She sat beside me on the couch as I looked through the contents. "I used to think Gloria saved everything because she was sentimental," she said, "but now I wonder if she kept these because she knew what she'd done." I didn't answer. Teresa was beginning to find her own way through the wreckage, and I respected the process. That same week, Michael came over with a school project, family heritage, a collage of where he came from. He wanted to include one of my paintings in the background, he said, because it felt like home. It was such a simple thing, but it landed deep. I realized in that moment that for all the ways I had once been pushed to the edges of their lives, I was finding my way back in, not through confrontation, but through quiet consistency. We worked on the project together at my kitchen table, surrounded by glue sticks and old photographs, bits of string and pressed flowers. He asked questions I hadn't expected, about my parents, about the house I grew up in, even about his mother as a child. I answered carefully, truthfully, but gently. There were stories I'd never been asked to tell before, and in the telling, I felt something loosen, as if part of me had been holding its breath for years. That evening, after Michael had gone home, I sat in my reading chair with the box Teresa had given me, sorting through the past. There were moments that made me smile, others that made my chest ache, but none of it made me bitter, not anymore, because the woman I was now, the one who painted and read poetry aloud to herself, who went on day trips with her book club and took pictures of cloud formations for fun, she had grown out of those broken pieces, not despite them, because of them. I realized then that reconciliation, when it happens, isn't a single act. It's not a conversation, or an apology, or a visit with a box full of old letters. It's a long, slow return. The invitation came on a Tuesday, tucked between credit card offers and a community newsletter in my mailbox. It was a simple cream-colored envelope, hand-addressed in Teresa's familiar handwriting. Inside was an invitation to Michael's school play. He was playing the moon, a very dignified role, as Teresa wrote in parentheses, followed by a small smiley face that felt like a peace offering wrapped in humor. I held the card in my hand longer than necessary, reading the date and time over and over, as if some part of me still needed to be convinced I was welcome. That night, I found myself digging through a box of old photographs again, this time looking for a picture of Teresa in her second grade play. She had worn wings made of cardboard and glitter, held on with elastic straps I'd repurposed from an old backpack. Her cheeks were rounder then, her eyes wide with the kind of unfiltered joy that children rarely carry into adulthood. I traced the edge of the photo, remembering how proud she had been, how she ran into my arms after the curtain closed, saying, "Did you see me, Mom? Did you really see me?" I had seen her. I had always seen her, even when she stopped looking back. The night of Michael's play arrived with an early spring chill, the kind that made me reach for a scarf even though the sun had been shining earlier. The auditorium was already filling when I got there, parents balancing cups of coffee, children in mismatched costumes darting down the aisles. I spotted Teresa near the middle row, her eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on me. She smiled, small but real, and scooted over to make room beside her. We didn't speak much as we waited for the show to begin, just small remarks about the decorations and the number of families crowded into the space. But her body leaned toward mine just slightly, and I took that as enough. The lights dimmed, and the children filed onto the stage, some in silver stars, others wrapped in tissue paper suns and papier-mâché planets. Michael stood near the back, a circle of silver cloth draped over his shoulders, his eyes searching until they found ours. When he saw me, something in his face lit up, not surprise, but certainty, like he had hoped I'd be there and somehow knew I would. I felt a warmth spread through me, soft and steady, not the fierce kind of love that claws for space, but the quieter kind that builds its own shelter. The play itself was charming in its way. Disjointed lines, wobbly props, a soundtrack that skipped twice, but I didn't care. I watched Michael say his lines with the same kind of deliberate clarity Teresa once had. He bowed low at the end, hands at his sides, and the audience clapped louder than the moment probably deserved. I clapped hardest. Afterward, in the school hallway, Teresa turned to me and said, "He was so happy you came." I nodded, but didn't say what I was really thinking, that I had needed to be there just as much as he had needed me to be, that sometimes showing up was the beginning of healing, not just for others, but for ourselves. We lingered a while longer, letting Michael run around with his classmates, while Teresa leaned against the wall, arms folded, her voice softer than usual. "I think I've spent most of my life trying to be good at things," she said suddenly. "At work, at being a wife, even at being a daughter, but maybe I missed the part where I was supposed to be present too." I didn't rush to respond. She wasn't asking for forgiveness, just space to say something aloud. Later that evening, back home, I wrote the date on my calendar. Not because I was likely to forget, but because I wanted to remember. A quiet night, a silver costume, a seat saved in the middle row. Sometimes restoration doesn't come in grand gestures or dramatic apologies. Sometimes it arrives gently, an invitation to a school play tucked between bills, and it is enough. Summer arrived with little fanfare, just a gradual shift in light and a subtle warmth that stayed longer each day. I found myself waking earlier, not out of habit or need, but because the quiet morning hours had become my own. I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, sketchpad in hand, and let the stillness of that time settle over me. The house, once filled with tension and waiting, now breathed at its own pace, no looming expectations, no anxious checking of my phone, just slow, deliberate days filled with the small pleasures I used to postpone indefinitely. I spent more time in my makeshift studio, where canvases leaned against the wall and jars of brushes lined the windowsill like old friends. My style had loosened. I stopped worrying about technique and leaned into feeling, into the joy of colors bleeding together, of lines that didn't need to be clean, to be honest. Sometimes I caught myself humming as I painted, not because I was happy in a loud, obvious way, but because something in me had quieted, and in that quiet, joy returned. Michael continued coming by, his sketchpad always in tow. We rarely spoke while we worked, but there was comfort in the silence between us. One afternoon, he looked at one of my paintings and asked, "Did it really look like this?" I told him it didn't matter. "This is how it felt," I said. He nodded without questioning. That was enough. A few weeks later, Teresa invited me over for dinner. Nothing formal, no holiday, just a warm evening, grilled vegetables on the table, string lights overhead, and a lemon tart that Michael insisted I try first. She looked different, not in appearance, but in presence, less tightly wound, more like someone willing to let the moment unfold without scripting it. We laughed a little, lingered longer after dessert, and let conversation move without direction. There was no heavy talk that night, no digging through the past, only now. That, to me, felt more healing than any apology. After dinner, Teresa showed me a worn scrapbook Michael had started. Inside were pages filled with ticket stubs, photos, scraps of ribbon, dried paint. One page held a picture from my gallery show, and beneath it, he'd written in shaky print, "Grandma paints how things feel, not just how they look." I touched the corner of the page and let the weight of that sentence settle in me. I wasn't just filling space in his life, I was shaping it. When I stood to leave, Teresa walked me to the car. She didn't say much, but the way she reached for a hug felt different. Not performative, not necessary, just real. "See you Tuesday?" she asked as she stepped back. And it wasn't said with obligation or guilt. It was a hope, an invitation. That kind of softness used to scare me. Now I recognized it for what it was, the start of something tender. Driving home, the sky had already deepened into that velvet blue I loved. When daylight fades, but night hasn't fully arrived, I rolled down the window and let the air fill the car. It felt like exhaling after a long-held breath. I thought of how long I had tried to prove my worth by giving parts of myself away, by dimming who I was to make space for everyone else, but not anymore. I had learned, slowly and stubbornly, that real love didn't require my disappearance. It asked me to show up whole. And now, in this late chapter of my life, I had chosen to stay, not in the shadows, not as a silent helper, but as someone seen, someone full dot, someone enough.